Welcome to the Decipher podcast. My name is Dennis Fisher. I am the editor-in-chief of Decipher, and with me today is Amy Bogac, who is a longtime security executive and has a long history in systems administration, which we're going to hit on, and a whole bunch of other things. Amy, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Dennis. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this because, as I mentioned, you have not just a security background, but also a sysadmin and systems operation background, which is in the, you know, I think our generation of security people, a pretty common thing, but not so much these days, in the sort of current generation folks that came out of college in the 2000s or 2010s and are now working in security probably just have CS and security backgrounds, probably didn't run a network the way that you did and didn't have to learn a whole bunch of painful lessons. So I wanted to just kind of start by asking, how did you get into sort of the sysadmin network operations world to begin with?
Yeah, my origin story is a little different, right? My background and where I thought I would go career wise was in communications, right? So I thought I would do journalism like you're doing and be on TV, and those are all fun things to go through and learn about my education, but what really influenced me was, my dad was in cyber and he was a COBOL programmer, right? So I always had technology around me growing up. I was never afraid of it. So I don't know that I would say I'm a digital native. I'm definitely older than that group, but
Mhm.
it was something that I was always exposed to and not afraid of getting my hands dirty or learning how to, log into, systems at an early age. And when I was really coming out of college and thinking about what my choices were, I had a lot of fun fixing things. And I really just fell into that sysadmin, kind of building networks, deploying laptops, and found myself in a great opportunity to work at Allstate Insurance really early on in my career. 2001 is when I joined Allstate.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So we are almost exactly in the same joining the security slash computing world at the same time. That's about when I started covering security. So that would be in the era of all of the VBS worms and things like Code Red and Slammer and NIMDA and the I Love You virus and all of that kind of stuff. What was did you have, you might have gotten thrown into the deep end with that stuff around that time.
Yeah, I joined Allstate in the Network Operations Center in 2001, and my first experience of virus activity was the and it was really all about clicking on links, but it was the is it Maria Navratilova? Anna
Oh, Anna Kournikova.
Kournikova? Yeah, that's what
Yes.
the Anna Kournikova link, right? Like, and there was just it was just so innovative at the time, right? Again,
Mhm.
2001, innovative at the time, and it really started exposing, I think, enterprise, like corporate enterprise in IT shops, that this was no longer like a hacking and it was no longer about the telecom space. It was no longer about the government, that there was enterprises, joining companies joining their networks to the internet. And
Mhm.
this was a whole new attack surface for these threat actors that had been building momentum, in the late 90s. So the Anna Kournikova Code Red was one in July that I remember vividly, because it was really the first time you saw the need to protect your network in a different way, right? A workstation getting infected, one off, that's cool. But having your peer-to-peer, having these viruses build peer-to-peer networks and
Yeah.
tie these threats together was really innovative. And it was really something that we had to learn how to be responsive to. We were very much tied to performance at that time, right? I grew up, and I say this often right now, I grew up in a time in technology where it was about red to green. If something was down, your time, your mean time, your performance measurement as an employee was how quickly could you restore that service.
Yeah.
And that's really how I grew up, is red to green. And when I say that today, I get a lot of Like, what? But like, what does that mean? Right? Like, back up over that, especially when I take for granted, how people grew up either in IT or in corporate America. And if that's not a common thing that they know what that means, meaning service is unavailable and we bring service back, regardless of why the service was unavailable. That was, really what I did for 5 years at the beginning of my career is network and server and workstation kind of performance and keeping things up and running for at Allstate. We had 100,000 endpoints. We
Oh,
we ran the allstate.com property in-house, right? There was a web operations team that monitored to make sure the web service was up.
yep.
They had a problem if they had to bind or unbind servers because of performance related issues on a website. You had to call the operations team to take those in and out of service. So it's just a different world. I know those teams still exist today, but I
Sure.
think they're really far away from like you said, the folks that grew up because they wanted to be in cyber or they got an IS degree. They may have skipped that basic IT operations experience that you and I kind of
Yeah.
remember so well.
I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s timeframe, when a lot of companies like Allstate were first putting things online or connecting, say, all their, various locations across the country to their corporate network, there was just an IT team. And like, if you had one person that knew a little bit of security, they were like, okay, you're the security person right now. This is now your job. In addition to this other job, you still have to do that, but now you're security too.
Mhm.
And then eventually, you build a security team and things like that. But I think it was more of an environment where you had to learn as you went and you got a little taste of everything, like you just mentioned, web, performance, network operations, some security thrown in there, all of that kind of stuff. And so you got your feet wet in all those different areas. And so you probably were like, security's kind of fun. There's a lot of stuff happening over here. Let me go see what's going on.
It is, and I learned a lot about how to communicate. Right when you have an outage for a region because there's a telecom outage and
Hmm.
you have 40 offices in that region, you have to communicate. You have to communicate to those offices, to those sales leaders, those business leaders, so that standard of care for critical operations has just always been part of my IT leadership DNA, right? You escalate, you know how to have it, you have a plan, you have a checklist, you run the playbook, you know who has the ball, meaning who's going to make the tough calls, right?
Yeah.
So you get into some of that code red, buffer overflow. You get into some of the Nachi, Nimda, Blaster,
Oh
SQL
my God.
Slammer, right? There had to be there was discussions. We had to escalate when we saw things on the network really proliferating throughout the network. And if we felt like we needed to stop that activity, that unauthorized activity, even though we didn't call it that back in the day, you had to get permission. You had to ask for permission at the time. Like, I've
Yeah.
assessed the situation and now I'm going to escalate to my leadership because we're going to make a change, right? Because again, our sole purpose in life was to keep this network at green at all cost. But if you are intentionally going to take a network down, there was in 2001, 2002, 2003, there was a lot of discussion about that. Like, you don't get to make that call. You don't understand the business impact. You're IT. Okay. Okay. So that's really where I learned you have to have these tough conversations up front. It kind of, you see it today. I can tie that back to, my experience over the past year as well. You have to have trust with your executives, and you have to be able to say the hard things, and you have to test that out in a tabletop to say, okay, if we have an event in 2024, who's going to make the tough call to take systems offline to impact business, possibly, hopefully, fast enough to protect the greater good of the environment? We may have an impact. We may have some downtime. We may have some struggles restoring service with legacy technology, but who gets to make that call? And that's really where I'm at today, kind of advocating for have better conversations today before you have an event so that when you are in the fight, You don't have to ask for permission to make really difficult decisions. I remember distinctly a network issue at Allstate in like 2002. Um, and there was a discussion like, we see up this peer-to-peer networking virus spreading. We
Hmm.
know it's in here right now. It's going to go here next. Like, we're seeing it. In the 10 minutes it took to get the right people on a call to have a conversation about should we shut the network down, by the time the discussion completed and that people said, okay, it was too late. The network was dead. Right. And it was at that time, it was like DDoS and buffer
Yeah.
overflow. It was things that you physically then had to go to every switch and turn off each port and remediate the device that was infected
Yeah.
before you turned it back on the network and brought it back online, right? Like the restoration process, even back then, was very manual, very tedious. But the good news is, from a virus, you knew what was going to happen. It was coded. Everybody was infected
Right.
with the same thing. Today, those threat actors are doing the harm manually. They have awareness. They have kind of that situational awareness. They can react if a tool or a security operations professional is doing some blocking and tackling. So
Hmm.
the threat landscape today is a far more dynamic than it was back then.
Yeah.
And you can't wait 10 minutes, you get two. And do you think you can even get on a phone call, let alone, make a decision and press the big red button that you hopefully have? For anybody watching that hasn't dusted off their big red button protocol to, network segment their environment and protect themselves, dust that off, check that out, right? Those are things that we have to do. You only get 2 minutes today. You
Yeah.
don't get 10.
If that. And as you mentioned, it's so much more dynamic now because you have attackers who do reconnaissance. They know more about your network than you do in some cases. They've spent months learning about it. They do the initial access, or maybe they buy initial access from someone else,
Yeah.
sit on the network, decide what they want to do. Maybe they deploy ransomware, maybe they exfil some data, maybe they do both. And by the time you might notice it, it's probably too late, and you have to make some real hard decisions. Like, do we take this offline? What do we do right now? And if you haven't had those conversations with the C-suite or, just higher ups ahead of time, you are in deep, deep water right there. You can't, that's not the time to have those discussions.
Right.
It's like having conversations with your kids. If you haven't had like conversations about what you expect from them and
Yeah.
then they screw up, like that's kind of your fault. Like you
Yeah.
need to communicate better.
Exactly. And the planning pieces of it, I think tabletops are a great tool to get exposure to people that aren't familiar with operations management. And again, it doesn't have to be always about a security event, right? This is just, red, again, back to the basics, red to green. But if you're not having those discussions and you're not building trust and you don't have a playbook that you're testing and you say during the test, um, if A, then B, and we're going to shut the network down because we have unauthorized access or we don't know, right? That's really where
Yeah.
I think people struggle is, and I think where people are really getting anxious around some of this SEC disclosure activity.
Oh yeah.
You have the legal teams and the finance teams, right? The CFO is the one closest to the SEC, I think, at times, and the legal team.
Hmm.
And they have a mindset of, well, we're going to be conservative and we're going to have to disclose, but how do you know when the right time is? You may not know. You may know that you have unauthorized access, but you don't know the extent of the damage.
Right.
And honestly, building that trust and letting the security leader of your organization press the big red button, even if there's a potential impact to your business, a potential impact to your supply chain. Uh, you know, if you trust enough, you can hope that your team is going to be able to make that tough call and prevent the more disastrous conversation, right? It is better to be positioned to make the big red button call, then it's too late and you don't have any ability to scale or manage or control your environment at all.
Right.
It's a tough conversation and it takes a lot of trust. And I think our current environment with our financial teams, our legal teams, our board, these are conversations that really need to continue to be brought forward. Building trust, exposing what will really happen. If I make this call, there's going to be pain. But if I don't make this call, the pain could be greater.
Yeah, I mean, especially you mentioned the SEC part of it. We've seen, especially in the last couple months, with some of the new regulations, where companies are having to decide: is this material? Do we have to, file an 8K and let everybody know about this, or can we sort of, you know, take some internal actions and then we'll figure it out later? But I do think we're starting to see people err on that side of disclose, like file with the SEC as soon as we think we might have to, just to sort of avoid any of the back end consequences that might come up. I mean, we've seen some pretty harsh consequences for executives, CFOs, CISOs in the industry in the last couple of years for, making some of those judgment calls that don't turn out well. And you mentioned the trust piece of it, Amy. How difficult is it to build that trust with the executives or upper management to say, listen, we know what we're doing. You hired us because we're good at our jobs. Let us go do our jobs.
Yeah, the building of trust is a very touchy thing, right?
Yeah,
It is hard to build and easy to lose.
for sure.
And I think every individual relationship is going to be different. And so that's why, like, advocating for people to have group conversations, build trust at that group level, build trust that you're going to do the right thing at the right time in a specific context. Um, and really kind of key on that. Like, in this situation, this is what we're going to do. And then when you're in that situation, you do what you said you were going to do, right? Number one, that's a way you build trust with anybody.
Yeah.
But I think that is the key behind some of the SEC decisions as that continues to mature and evolve and organizations continue to figure out what that means for them. Um, you know, if you said you were going to, in your playbook, right? Hypothetically, if you had a ransomware playbook and you said you would invoke your crisis management team and that would engage your legal and your third party legal potentially and your executive team and your board would be notified, right? If you do all the things that you said you were going to do, and a year ago, we all had to update our playbooks to include our SEC team if you're a publicly traded company. So whoever is your legal partner is for your SEC, your financial team is probably different than your cyber legal partner. And so you build that relationship with that group and you include them in your documentation and you say with intention, I'm going to notify this person and this person. Again, when you do what you say you're going to do, it builds trust and you execute the plan. And it isn't always perfect because you're executing a plan against an unintended activity, right?
Right.
Undesirable activity, a threat
Yeah.
actor who has chosen you out of the hat at Black Hat or DEF CON, right? So you're working through those scenarios, but the SEC is going to and has already said if you say what you're going to do and you do what you said, right, that is what we expect of you. And it includes having a thoughtful way to define when you believe you have a material event, and you're going to disclose that as soon as you have that information. So
Yeah. I think defining what's material is becoming one of the big sort of stumbling blocks for a lot of CISOs and, general counsels and comms professionals. Honestly, they're sort of looking at these things and is this material to the business? Is it material to our customers? Is it material to our operations? Did we have to take, a large part of our network offline for X amount of hours or days? That's probably material to your operations. So you might as well drop the AK, let everyone know, and, go about your business. because there are different definitions of material depending on what your business is and what the incident is.
100%. And when you know you're going to have customer impact or external facing impact to some way, the 8K disclosure process, I think, is really a strong way to tie a bow around notifying. You're going to notify your customers, or they're going to see an impact at either their availability, orders are going to get rejected, whatever it is
Yeah,
you interact with your customers. That is going to help you inform that materiality. I think it is really effective to drop the 8K as quickly as possible when you know you have that external lens that is going to also need to be communicated, because now you have a good, strong communication practice. I said earlier, right? My
yeah,
degree, my background was in communication, so I believe in that. I believe that piece of the puzzle that leaders and cyber leaders have to have with their teams is that communication piece. And that's what your corporate communications team is going to want with your investors, your shareholders, your board, your consumers. And that's the best way to tie a bow around this, because you've done it in all angles, inclusive of the 8K.
I do think that it's in these situations it's always better to over communicate than on the other side, because there's been some incidents recently where the company disclosed it but then hasn't said anything for 3 or 4 months. You just don't hear anything about it. What happened, especially if it's a private company that's not publicly traded, they
Mm-hmm.
can sort of just be like, yeah, we told you, but now we don't have to tell you anymore. We're just going to go do our stuff and you can figure it out yourselves. Like, so
Yeah. And honestly, that's really where personally my background in operations, I think, was helpful in the situation that we went through, because we did take swift action and we had the right partners teed up to help us identify what the impact was as quickly as possible. Absolutely, that is not true for every event right now. There's a lot
no,
of companies who, you know, maybe their network is completely decimated and they can't even get to that understanding of, data exfiltration versus just damage versus, any, just availability, right?
right.
There's still a lot of work that has to be done, but advocating for acting quickly helps you, kind of get your arms around things faster.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can say it.
No, I agree. And as you mentioned earlier, having the plan and knowing what to do when something happens is, you know, comforting isn't the right word, but at least you have something to open up and be like, okay, we're going to start at step 1 and then we'll go to step 2 and then we'll just keep going. We know what we're doing. Yeah, there's going to be some deviations along the way as we figure out other things that have happened or other actions we might need to take, but at least you have an idea what the hell you're doing. And you're not just running around like unplugging things like, in 2001.
We did.
Yeah, of course.
And honestly, there are still times where I have seen that tactic, right?
Yeah,
Where,
yeah,
it that is why, that big red button scenario, right? Practicing putting that into your test, testing out and business continuity. Back in 2001, 2002, do you remember planning for the avian H1N1?
yes. The bird flu. Yes.
Yeah, so we built pandemic, plans in 2001. Did we know we would need those 20 years later?
Nope.
We're kind of in the same situation. The things that were important to blocking and tackling the basics of your network are the same today as they were then. But we have, and you and I touched on this a little bit, the people that we have in IT security today, they may not have had that basic operations experience. And then if you don't have it, go talk to somebody who did. There's a lot of us in this space, still, that remember those days, that are willing to share those stories and
Yeah.
experiences. Microsoft patching for a patch. I know you just did. I saw you guys did an article about the Verizon DBIR, and still about patching,
Yeah.
not being timely enough, right? yeah, in 2003, 2004, Microsoft was patching their environment once a week, right? Enterprise teams couldn't keep up with that.
Yeah.
And I think that the teams kind of gave up a long time ago and went to this monthly patching cadence, and then it gets stretched out to 45 days or 65 days. And that,
Right.
we're, again, get back to basics, because there are just some ways you'll be able to reduce the impact of an event. You may never be able to, there's no silver bullet for 100% prevention, but some of these basics really help you reduce the impact, because you have strong operations leadership, you have trust because people know what you're going to do in those situations. And if you're really doing good with your environmental hygiene, then recovery should be faster, right? If you know you have an environment that has really poor hygiene, server 2000, it is 2024, right?
It is, but those are still online. They are out there.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that those imagine if you're running a business process on a technology that isn't supported by the vendor anymore,
Oh yeah.
and you have a need to take those things offline. How are you going to bring that back?
Yeah. I know. It's brutal. There's still like IAS servers that are, sitting out there from like 2003 or 4 or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you went through an incident last year when you were at Clorox, and I just wanted to ask you, like, what lessons did you take away from that whole process that, you can share with everybody, and that you hope you can carry forward in your next few roles?
Yeah, I have thought a lot about this, and even kind of working on formalizing my thoughts around, if I knew then what I know now.
Hmm.
And we've touched on a couple things, right? The hygiene of it, and the making sure that you have a plan and you execute the plan, and very you build trust somehow in your operations leadership. Number one, right? It doesn't have to be your SecOps person that sees a network impact. That it can be the network person, right? Somebody just has to have the authority to make a quick call to help prevent further disasters or a disastrous outcome.
Yeah.
The DR and BC thing, I say that a little bit tongue in cheek about, the pandemic planning, but really business continuity and disaster recovery, I think, are things that we take for granted. Again, in 2024, they're terms, they're old IT terms, and they don't seem to resonate with people today. But I think that DR is gets misconstrued. Is DR disaster recovery, like because you had a failure at your data center? Maybe not anymore, because we move so much to SaaS, so we feel more protected. We have this false sense of security because it's no longer physical data anymore. It's in the cloud, right? But does that really mean that you have the ability to recover that information and that application, right? So I think DR has become a little bit of data recovery, and people view it as data. Can I get my data back? And we can do immutable backups all day long, and we'll be, IT basics again, 101. Make sure you can always recover your data, but can you recover your application? Do your business partners know what that means? Right? If an application is offline, either a SaaS because your network is unavailable to it,
Hmm.
or it's unavailable to you internally, does the business continuity plan know how to help people through a manual business process today? I don't know that they do. I think SaaS has made us a little bit complacent in business process knowledge, because we train people on how to use a tool instead of what the business process is.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. I think we just saw that with the Change Healthcare breach in the last few months, where that had so many downstream effects to pharmacies, doctors' offices, providers, clinics, hospitals. People were literally processing claims like on paper and faxing them if they had a fax machine. That's obviously a almost worst case scenario, but things like that do happen. Ransomware groups go after backups now. They go after cloud providers. They go after everything they can get their hands on.
Yeah.
So how do you plan for recovering when you can't trust any of the data? Can't even trust your backups.
Yeah.
Those are really brutal questions to ask, but that's the reality we live in now.
It is. And those threat actors, different than the way Dennis, you and I grew up in the industry, those are threat actors that are acting as humans, right? We talked a little about it's not a virus that's coded to do one thing anymore. It is a group of threat actors coordinated at the same time, using their knowledge about your environment, pivoting, playing off each other, sharing intel. And your one security operations guy on call overnight cannot handle five
Yeah.
or six adversaries working against him at the same time, right? It
Yep.
is, the world has changed, and I think we need some better. Don't even get, I'm sure we'll dig into in artificial intelligence, but the threat actors are going to use artificial intelligence, to make their attacks faster too. And
Yeah.
we need better tools on the security operations side. We need some artificial intelligence based SecOps tools that will help us recover quicker or prevent faster. And you can't prevent everything, but you can prevent, the overall scope or impact of an event.
Yeah. I mean, some of these attacks that we're seeing are against organizations that have extremely mature security programs, understand how things work, how to defend their organizations, have all the budget and tools at their disposal, but they still get hit
Mm-hmm.
because, as you mentioned, the threat actors have time on their side. They don't really have day jobs. They're just kind of doing this. They have a lot of knowledge. They have a lot of tools, and they can coordinate their activities. And just sort of wait you out and find the one way in. It's not in, you see people getting blamed in the news for things. And like, that always just kind of, annoys me because everyone makes mistakes and you can't be right 100% of the time. Threat actors can find ways in. It's just, that's literally their jobs.
Yep.
They're pretty good at it these days.
It is.
You know?
And even the tools that we do have are the ones that, we have multiple layers of tools. We have ones that'll help
Sure.
you prevent, but really the big key is detection. And now more than ever, our need for is the response to be as fast as possible is how you limit the destruction that they cause.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe one last thing for folks that are, getting into the industry now, getting into security, or maybe hoping to get into cybersecurity. We keep hearing about like, oh, there's 8 billion open security jobs and nobody to fill them. Sure. Um, would you recommend that folks maybe sort of, maybe not take the route that you specifically did, but sort of get a taste of, operations, sysadmin, networking, and sort of understand the broader picture?
I do. Security professionals are like a Swiss Army knife. And if you only train in one area because that's where you found passion in school,
Mhm.
then you're only going to be able to fulfill that one piece of the Swiss Army knife. And maybe it's the long sword, and that's cool, but the can opener is just as important. Right. So I do think there is value in having experience and rotation throughout different pieces of infrastructure, even work. I mean, workstation is a
Yeah.
great place for people to get their feet wet to understand how to protect a Microsoft operating system or a Mac operating system in a corporate environment, and really all of these parts of the ecosystem play in. Obviously, I was a Cisco networking person, first, and I it's just part of who I am, and that DNA I think is part of what I built on for a career, and I think that it means a lot, and I have been successful in that. I also think you have to today blend that with good business knowledge.
Yeah.
So even though my undergraduate degree is in communications and I spent my career in IT, also chose to get an MBA because if you really want to be taken seriously at the executive level and talk to your board, you have to be able to speak their language. You have to be able to associate risk of the cyber landscape with business language that they understand.
That's a great point. I do feel like even as recently as maybe 10 or 12 years ago, the security and IT folks were security and IT folks, and the business people were the business people. And the two would pass each other in the hall and kind of look the other way, like in high school. But, and they were like, that's not my business, and that's not my business. I do computers and they do business things. I don't know what that is. You
Mm-hmm.
can't, you really can't afford to do that anymore, especially at the senior level or even mid management level.
Yep.
You have to have some base of knowledge in both areas, I feel like.
There's a lot of press about the companies over the last 2 years that have gone through that pain and now have
Yeah,
a heightened sense of security awareness. That's for sure.
that's a fact. Yeah. Well, Amy, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I truly enjoyed it. This is really a lot of fun. And I look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
Appreciate you, Dennis. Thanks so much for your time.
All right. Take care.
Cheers.